One more question, so the gentleman in the hat will be the last person, but let's go over on this side first.
My name is Blair Bobiar. I work with the New America Foundation. Is there any data, questions about how the selection of participants would work? For example, random, like a jury pool, or more elected like the legislature? I would think there'd be more negative consequences if it was the latter.
Yeah. We had a couple of questions that looked at various alternatives there, and what we generally found was that it was a level of complexity that was hard for voters to sort of wrap their minds around. That's the perfect kind of discussion to have in a more qualitative setting, as I was describing, when you can sort of get a focus group together and talk to people about those things in more detail.
Okay. John.
Antonio Gonzalez from the Willie Velazquez Institute. I have more of a comment than a question, because the way we use polling in these kinds of things is counterintuitive to what we're trying to do with the Constitutional Convention. Meaning, typically pollsters tell you what you shouldn't do, right? Don't touch this issue, it's a third rail. You can't get a majority on that one. Stick with this narrow issue. And in the Constitutional Convention, we're talking about addressing all of the third rail issues. So by definition, there's a limited usefulness in the early stages of what polling can do, because we're really talking about creating opinion as we go through a process. So I just wanted to ask you how you dealt with that contradiction.
That's a very good point to raise, and I think the structure of our polling, and hopefully the way I've presented it, is trying to avoid the dynamic you described. We're not trying to tell you based on the data you should do this, you shouldn't do that. And because of that concern, we tried to keep the questions we asked fairly broad, fairly conceptual, to try to just understand, is this idea of a convention something that voters instantly gravitate to? Is it something they completely reject? Or do they have mixed feelings about it? And I think what we found is that middle category. They're more positive than negative, but they have a lot of questions. And so the goal of this research is by no means to shut off any debate or to shut off any options, but simply to say that there seems to be enough interest out there among the public that it's worth this group and others pursuing the idea and opening that conversation with voters.
Good morning, Cynthia Murray, North Bay Leadership Council. I was intrigued with your results on the open primary, which when you asked it wasn't something that we are going to be voting on, and I'm wondering how you feel we should proceed now that we have an understanding that there is seemingly strong support for it.
Yeah. What we tested was a short conceptual description of an open primary, and obviously voters found it very appealing. About 2/3 in our survey said that they would support it. Now that there is going to be some sort of an open primary measure moving forward to the ballot in June, the way that it's written, the way that the language that's presented to voters is structured is likely to have a significant impact on voters' level of support. We've certainly seen a number of variations of open primary measures in the state before that have had different amounts of success depending on how they were structured and how the campaigns were run. So I think all we can conclude from this poll is that the core concept is one that voters like. How that translates into the specific proposal they see before them will determine its likelihood of being successful.
Thank you.
Okay. Last question, please.
Why am I wearing a hat? Because I'm different than all of you. I'm the chairman of the American Independent Party. My name is Markham Robinson, third largest party in the state. And it's my understanding, reflecting our numbers, it's my understanding that at the beginning of the state of California, when it was admitted to the Union, that it was permitted, as was Texas, to be divided into several states. And if it were, I believe the number was 3, correct me if I'm wrong. And if it were divided, of course, each and every one of them would want to have a constitutional convention. The difficulties of uniting the interests of this very diverse state in so many dimensions could be reduced if we would divide the problem.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.
And what do you think about that?
No, I don't.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you for all of the questions and comments. And as Dave said, the early research was not intended to be definitive. It was just to open the conversation that we hope to continue over the course of the days. But very informative. Thank you for doing that. So we are close to on schedule, but I'd like to get us back on schedule. So if we could take a break and be back at your seats at 10:30, that would be terrific. So thank you, and be back at 10:30 for our next conversation.